entitled Working Together, Roles, Responsibilities, and Policies. Covers a lot of ground. Before you move to begin your discussion, we'd like to suggest a few things to keep in mind that may assist in your thinking and inform the discussion a little bit. The basic question that's posed under this topic is how can citizen members best assist the City Council in making budget decisions? And with that in mind, we're going to ask councilors to make comments first, and then a second round of comments from citizen members, and then after that, open discussion, including executives. So we have everybody involved by the end of the topic. I want to offer 3 prompts that'll help perhaps the discussion a little bit. First, what is council's expectation of what citizen members bring to the process? Second, where do citizen members fit on policies and council goals?
Say it again, I'm sorry.
Okay. Where do citizen members fit on policies and goals? And the first question was, what is council's expectation for what citizen members bring to the process? And last, we suggest you put some consideration into what is citizen members' role in preparation and review of the budget overall, comprehensive. So we'd like to suggest we begin with Claire, who is a counselor and also has extensive experience as a citizen member of the Budget Committee. And then we'll go through the counselors and then the citizen members will have an opportunity.
Sure. So, you know, when I served on the Budget Committee and when I came to the Budget Committee, I didn't bring any particular expertise in finance or management, and so I think somewhat of what citizen members bring might depend on if they have a particular background relevant to budgeting. But beyond that, I think what I tried to bring was the perspective of the average citizen, whatever that means, or resident. The idea that not having the insider perspective on how all these decisions are made and where they come to, but what do I want to see from my city, and what do I want to offer in terms of guidance and perspective for both the near term, the particular budget that we were working on, and the long term, thinking about how do we keep our city functioning going forward. So I think for me, that was how I tried to approach being a citizen member of the Budget Committee. Was I don't have all the answers, I just bring one particular perspective as someone who lives in the community and uses the services and hears from others who do that same thing. And then in terms of policy recommendations, I think that's always been kind of a tricky topic. When I was a citizen member, I would hear councilors express different points of view about how much input or weight should be given to the citizen members of the Budget Committee, and sometimes that could be a fairly heated debate amongst councilors. So my feeling is, and I kind of said this earlier before lunch, I think the perspective of citizen members, whether it's I'm really confused about this issue and how the council approaches this priority setting, or my idea is X, Y, and Z, and we should be doing it that way. I think all of that input is very valuable to the councilors who have a greater responsibility as being elected officials to craft policy that's going to guide the city going forward. So that's kind of how I see that piece as well. I don't necessarily think it's appropriate for citizen members of the Budget Committee to be setting policy, but I think because of the more in-depth perspective you have as citizen members of the Budget Committee, it's very appropriate and important to hear your input on what you think those policies might be or how they might be shaped. Did I miss anything?
Do we have a volunteer? Another counselor who'd like to speak? I'll call on someone. Oh, here we go.
Everything she said, first of all.
I love when you agree.
I know, isn't that fun? Secondly, or I suppose to add to that, because I thought that really captured well where I am in terms of the value of the citizen member on the budget committee, what part of the process. You're a set of community eyeglasses for us to see this stuff appropriately or clearly. You help us see it through the lens of your life experiences, but community values. What different parts of our community think are important. You help us see it with fresh eyes sometimes, because ongoing battles over issues at council table, you can miss some of the finer points of things or the more higher level thought or principle about a budget issue mired in other things that have long histories. So helping us see it with fresh eyes is often a very important part of that. But predominantly it's that filter of trying to help us see what the larger community, because you're a community member who has a better exposure to the process and the information. You can help us see clearly where the rest of the community might come down on something. It helps us make better decisions at the end of the day.
Yeah, I agree with both Claire and Mike. Also, in my opinion, I think the budget committee, the citizen members of the budget committee are probably the most important committee members throughout the entire city organization, because they're dealing with the budget, and without the budget nothing else moves. But not only do I see them as an extra set of eyes, but also an extra mouth to take what we're doing out to the community to try to explain to the best of their ability why we're making the decisions we're making based on the information that we have. So not only their eyes, but they're also an extension of the council to go out in the community, hopefully to get the more community involvement. And, as far as policy, we have people come every Monday night telling us what they think policy should be. I have no problems whatsoever with people questioning policies, and if they've got a way to fix it, give us that recommendation. And what better way than somebody that we're working side by side with through this entire process to say, this isn't working, and maybe it works better this way. So I don't want to say that they're policy scrutinizers, but if it comes up, I think it would be worth the council's while to listen to what they're saying and maybe take it into consideration and have a policy discussion at a later time.
Yeah, in a simplistic way, the policymakers decide what we need to do, and the staff decides how to do it. I mean, that's really at a fundamental level kind of the way things are supposed to divide out. And you say, well, where does a budget committee fit into that model? They're not the elected officials who make the policy. They're not the staff who intimately understand the city organization well enough to know how this stuff interconnects. So what's my role? Well, it's defined in a paragraph, but it's also a fact that how you spend your money is a reflection of your priorities and your policies. Therefore, the budget committee is engaged in being involved in the implementation of policy, even if they didn't actually set it. So you can't just kind of make this a pure model. You can't extract the budget committee, because they are an expression of how you're going to finance your priorities. And to that degree, it is absolutely appropriate for a budget committee member to say, I am comfortable on supporting financially this policy, I am uncomfortable supporting this policy. And then you work it through. So it's really not a role that says budget committee members create policy, because that's what the elected officials are supposed to do. But they can be a touchstone for whether those policies still make good financial sense. And you rub each one of those policies against the touchstone, and if it comes out gold, then it's a good policy, and we can proceed with it. That's why it's a very important role for the budget committee to serve in that function, to be able to say that is a reasonable expenditure of your money in support of that policy. And that's the discussions I've been hearing at this body. That's why I think this body has become as appropriate as it is we spend less time talking about how to spend the money, because we're not traffic engineers, we're not law enforcement officials, we're not park managers, but we can rub that policy against the touchstone and say whether or not it seems like something that we should be investing our money in, and that is very appropriate to do. So from that standpoint, that's where I think this budget committee is a good one and does good work and can continue in that vein. I was telling Chelsea yesterday, I don't want to set up a situation where we give the budget committee all sorts of expectations that they can be engaged in policy and then yank them back as if they're on a leash. Because that would be unfair and it would be inappropriate. So I think having this discussion today is important not only from budget committee members understanding what their role is, but from city councilors also understanding what their responsibility is in investing their budget committee.
I'm just sitting here thinking about what's been said, but expectations, I expect the members of the committee to share their knowledge and their opinions and the opinions of other people they know in the community also. And I think that they do spend a lot of time with us, probably more than they might want to, but more than any other committee, as George had said, more than any other committee or commission, we work together. But when it comes to setting policy, that is the council's responsibility. Though policy is affected by everyone's opinions, and I think budget committee members are no more powerful than any citizen as far as determining what we do, but they may, they're not legally or not, but because they are probably better informed than most citizens, then their opinions might carry more weight with us, and because they have spent the time to learn more about it. But it's kind of difficult. It's difficult with any committee we appoint, temporary committees. They think, we spent all this time, now why don't you do what we said? And you consider it, but you don't necessarily accept. So I think it's important that people realize that. The budget committee might vote, we want this, and the council might eventually decide, no, that isn't the way we do it. And Mike was on the budget committee too. You mentioned that Claire was, but long ago Mike was on the budget committee, 2 terms, he says. Thank you.
I don't really have too much to add. I think most of the comments are pretty good. What my fellow councilors have said. I value the presence of the budget, the citizen members, because they're bringing, you guys are bringing your life experience and your business experience and your, to the table, and that's really important. It just kind of deepens it and broadens what we have, the council has, and I think it's perfectly okay that once citizen members become, more familiar with this really deep and complicated subject. I'm still grappling with it myself. To suggest policy changes. Make the suggestion. I'm always open for that. If someone can think of a way to improve upon or change our policies in a beneficial manner, I'm open to all suggestions. So. But yes, it is, the final decision does rest with the council, but I think the more input we get, it's always a good thing. So I value your experience and your participation.
I think we've covered all the councilors. Would any of the citizen members want to make some comments right now? I could repeat the questions if anybody wants me to. Any responses? Let's see. Again.
Well, I might repeat some things that have been said. I think as I joined this 2 years ago, I think that I'm here to provide perspective. I talked with the counselors I interviewed with about my history here in Eugene and some of my thoughts and so on, and they saw fit to put me on the group. I don't necessarily think of myself as representing citizens. I don't think of myself as representing any particular constituency or group, but I think of myself as a citizen of Eugene. I've lived here most of my life and plan to continue to live here, care a lot about the community. I'm also, I think, pretty knowledgeable as far as a citizen goes, and my role is to bring that perspective into this. I think I'm pretty clear on, I think there's some pretty bright lines between decision-making and providing input. I feel pretty clear on what the council's role is, and they're around making decisions on the budget. I have felt like as we go through the process, I have opportunity to provide quite a bit of input. It's certainly up to councilors how they choose to use that, and either incorporate it into how they make their decisions, or I guess maybe further refine whatever positions they might have. But at the end of the day, they make the decision on the budget. As it comes to policy, I guess I'm kind of on that same track. I hadn't, I guess, thought directly about it, other than I feel like I have a lot of opportunity to talk about policy. I think we're going to have opportunity to talk about it this afternoon, and able to, you know, if I so wanted to suggest that kind of thing. It's their job to set those policies. So again, I feel like there's a fairly clear line there. But I think has been said by probably a number of people already. I mean, I think the broader the discussion base can be on any of these matters, the richer that it can be, the more perspective there is, would, you know, just make it all much better. So that's mine.
I kind of look at this situation, being a citizen member. I think sometimes once you're an elected official, you have to be a little more careful with how you phrase things and say things. The press has a way of twisting them, misquoting, implying. I don't feel like I have those kind of restraints. I'm here as a member of our community to kind of speak my piece, maybe point out to the councilors and the other committee members what I am hearing, what I'm seeing within the committee or the community. And I feel that having that touch with the community that I've lived here since '64 gives me maybe a little more influence on the policies that the councilors may end up setting. I'm now part of that process instead of being one of the people standing out in the streets throwing stones at the glass house. And I always think it's better to try to make change from within. And I'm hoping that through my life experiences and all the traveling around that I've done, that I can bring some new perspectives from the outside where I'm not inhibited because I've been elected. I can be outspoken, and the worst you all can do is throw me off, and then I can go play golf. So.
Good afternoon. So the things that I think goals that I would have in my being on the commission, or committee, still used to saying commission. So providing a different perspective than everyone else at the table, of course. I happen to be younger than most of you, and I also have a technology background, which not everyone here has that as well. So I think each one of us citizen members provides a unique background, and I think that I do, and hopefully over the course of the next couple of years, that will allow me to provide an occasional insightful comment, an occasional policy suggestion, an occasional navigation idea, and hopefully at the right time, at the right place, it will be considered and move forward.
So I agree with a lot of what's been said. I also don't feel that I represent a specific constituency. However, I do consider myself an ambassador for the city and to the city. I think I make it a point to reach out to the community and try and have a two-way conversation and dialogue about both what's going on at the city and talk with community members about that, but also get input and feedback from community members. So I feel that I can bring that back to the table of the budget committee to, when I speak, I hope I'm speaking not just from my own personal perspective, but a broader perspective of community members that I interact with. And I think that's important, and I think, Robert, you mentioned not having to be as delicate maybe as an elected official while doing that, and I think that's also important. I bring a perspective of being a government employee. I work for the county now, and I've worked as a City of Eugene employee in the past and also in other jurisdictions. However, I also have a private sector perspective, and so I think that helps round out some different perspectives as well. And I think having a diverse amount of perspectives on the committee is important. The one thing I think, I don't know if it was Ken or Bob mentioned, is that we have a lot of opportunity to talk about policy. And I understand the budget document is a policy document, but I'm not sure I feel as much in terms of we get an opportunity to talk about policies that impact how the budget is carried out, or the policies that Christy talked about earlier in terms of how the budget is formed. So I would look forward to an opportunity where we could potentially build into the process more opportunity to talk about not just the budget as a policy document, but the policies that inform the budget as well, to make specific recommendations. And I think that's part of what we can do with this process, is make specific recommendations for the council to consider in looking at ways to modify how the budget's developed and implemented.
Laura? So I joined the budget committee or applied in the first place because the budget is, as someone else said, ideally a reflection of the city's priorities and the city's values. And that's the process that we go through. And as citizen members, we bring up a different perspective on what those priorities and values should be, what we hear they are, what we believe they are, and whether we feel that the budget then reflects those appropriately. In terms of the policy piece, first of all, it was really helpful for me to hear Councilor Pryor's comment a little bit about kind of the role of the budget committee vis-a-vis the role of staff. I think that can be really helpful in informing how we frame our conversation going forward as well, in terms of us really thinking primarily about some policy things and some of those priority questions and some of those trade-off questions, and creating the document, the policy document that guides that, but not necessarily getting down into the weeds for how the traffic should be engineered or whatever. And I think for me that was a helpful comment in terms of, if we only have a few meetings left, what level should we be focused as the budget committee? One of the things that to me is interesting in this conversation, and still I'd love some more thoughts and perspective from other people, to the mayor's comment about chicken and the egg, I've definitely heard comments about it's very helpful for the budget committee to provide feedback on some of these policy questions that inform the budget. And I've heard different perspectives on, is that something where the council provides the policy and the citizen members are this touchstone that gives feedback to the policy that's been, here's the policy that city council has created, hey, now citizen members please weigh in, which is a different way of going about it than, hey, citizen members, what do you think about this policy? Now we'll take your input and make a decision. And so I think it would be valuable to have some more perspectives on which, to me, those are slightly different paths, right? Is the council making a policy for comment and feedback, or is it all about just gathering input and then the council makes a decision, or is it both? So I think understanding what the group believes that should be, and probably what the council thinks that should be, for me would be really helpful. And then the final piece that I would still appreciate some more conversation around is the budget committee's role in discussions of revenue generation, because I think that for me has not felt as clear as the role of the citizen members around issues of spending priorities, cutting, different, that kind of thing. But where should the citizen members be involved in conversations about opportunities to pursue additional revenue. So those are my thoughts as a citizen member.
Jill and Marshall, would you like to speak?
I think that my feelings have been expressed. I mean, I think what Laura just said really is a good synopsis of what I feel too. Are we going to be involved in the conversation about what the policy should be, or is the city council going to meet about the policies and then those will guide us? I mean, I think, all I've heard today is like from the city is just, I think it's a reset of leadership, and it sounds to me like the city staff has done a really good job internally of having good leaders and coming up with policies, and a lot of time has gone by, and it sounds like it's time for the city council, with or without consultation from the budget committee, however they feel is most appropriate, to set the goals. And then as a member of the citizen budget committee, then I would look forward to participating at whatever level my thoughts would be best, would serve the council. So I guess I would just reiterate what everyone else has said on the budget committee too, because I think those are all valuable points.
Marshall or Chelsea?
So when I was talking to Chief Groves, this is one of the questions I had specifically for him is what exactly were we invited to here in terms of just this process? I feel like the City Council is excellent in terms of listening to citizens if we have suggestions in general, but in terms of making this process as efficient as possible and using our time wisely, what do you want from us? And when I think of policy, I think the questions that Christy asked us before, those are the types of things I was wondering about. Do you want our input on those through this process? And what I'm hearing is, yes, that's appropriate for here. So I really appreciate hearing that affirmed, and I hope to participate in those discussions as they come up.
Marshall? Okay. As a reminder, let's pull the microphones towards the person who's speaking, just because it doesn't pick up everybody, just a little bit away from the microphones. And that'll make it easier for those folks who are having a little trouble there. So what I'd like to do now is invite the staff and the mayor, executive staff and the mayor, to also participate. And I'd like to invite John in particular to make a comment at this point, and then open discussion, including everyone on these topics. So John, if you care to.
I'll pass for the moment.
Okay. Then we'll just open discussion. Raise a hand if you'd like to pursue the topic.
Are you asking
Oh,
for,
Mayor.
can I just clarify, are you asking the execs to weigh in on what we think the role is of the Budget Committee and the Council, or our own role?
The topic is the role of the Budget Committee, members, citizen, and elected members, councilors, to work together to have a cooperative relationship, to identify and understand roles and responsibilities, be clear on those, and policymaking and city council goals, so as to exchange our understanding of that and move towards clarity and understanding that we're all comfortable with for working together in the next few months and the next years. Execs are free to contribute. And the mayor.
What came to my mind when wrestling with the conversation we're having about the chicken egg thing is, I personally don't care which way it is. I just think you have to think about it being iterative. That if you need to know certain things or you need to make certain decisions before you can get to the next place to decide what you're going to do with the budget, if you really need to have a reserve policy before then, and you want, the council wants your input on that, then you have to kind of put things in order. So you establish those policies, you give your input, iteratively, council makes a decision, comes back, and then you can use those to make your budget decisions. So to me, there seems to be the need for some thoughtful order to how we go through this to get the input and to establish sort of the guidelines and move forward with those.
I'll say a couple things. It seems like the council, once they make the policy, and there could be a variety of ways of doing that, and
the budget committee would have some input to that, staff would have some input to that, it could be some public process. I would agree with the mayor that once the policy is made, and then what we do as a staff is submit a budget that tries to best meet the policy. Some of it's about services, some of it's about financial, and could be some other things. And then it seems like the one important role of the budget committee then is to reconcile those a little bit. That says, here's the policy, here's the budget that's presented. Is it a good way to meet those policy goals? And that's part of what the budget committee is doing. And it may be yes or no, or sometimes yes, sometimes no. And so then I think that's the budget committee process. I agree with Chris. It's about the what, not the how. But there's a lot of what discussion that can go on. That is the guidance that comes back eventually to the staff to implement. So.
Your thoughts? Laura?
So I'm not clear where we are. I mean, what I mean by that is this was a good discussion. I very much appreciate the feedback and insights into how different people see the role of the citizen members. Whether we do it now or whether we do it at the end of the day, I just want to make sure that we leave, given that we have still only a certain number of meetings and a certain amount of time together, with a clear understanding of what I thought I heard here, and I would like people to weigh in if I heard it incorrectly, is that there's a desire to have citizen members weigh in on some of these application of policy questions that Christy presented us with, then the city council to go and make a final decision about what those policies would be and how we would decide policy-wise to generally apply them. And then within that framework, then that's when we would begin as an overall budget committee to look at whether those budget decisions fit into that, as John said, meet those policy guidelines. So I just want to be sure that we leave here today clear as a team about that is how we're going to go forward in terms of understanding what we are going to be doing as citizen budget members, what the council will be doing, and we know then that that's an activity that we need to engage in as a next step is here's the process and the time when citizen members will weigh in on these things. Okay, then council will go away and take that input and make those decisions, and then that will come back to the budget committee as part of the budget process. So I would love feedback from the room if I'm not hearing it correctly or if that is what I heard in terms of next steps.
So just to clarify, so for example, in that first one there says one-time money, when is the right time to use one-time money? So what you're suggesting is the budget committee has some sort of discussion, conversation about that, provides your perspective, and then at some point the council, independent of the budget committee, will actually answer that question definitively. When is the right time to use one-time money? Then that sets the policy, and then during the budget process, as the budget committee is evaluating and reviewing the budget, part of that is are we using one-time money in conjunction or in the way in which the council said the policy is? Is that
that's what I'm suggesting, okay. And that's where I guess I would like feedback on that suggestion as a way forward.
So, based on what you just said, I would agree. I think that's a valuable way we could move forward. I would look forward to those conversations, specifically touching on these, and there might be others. I mean, Christy threw these as 5 or 6 out, and I think those sound like good starting points for sure. One I'll just focus on as an example is the balance versus prioritize, and something that John just said about reconciling the budget with the set policies is, I think from a budget committee member standpoint, we talked about these goals and the balancing of them. that just about anything could fit in there. So when it comes to reconciling, it's difficult to do that when there's not more clear policies set. So for instance, sorry about the reserve. I don't know if it's up there. The reserve balance. So if there's not a set policy around how much that reserve balance should be, then in order to reconcile a budget with something that's not set, it's really vague. So to me, that would be an opportunity to have those discussions and become more clear about it.
Just so it's a little easier to see.
I kind of want to reinsert something I said at the beginning. Most people credit Abraham Lincoln with having said that the Constitution isn't a suicide pact. I would ask that we not create a policy that puts us into a stark choice when that may not be the best choice, given more particulars in a circumstance. So I would encourage us, again, towards the idea of flexibility in all of these policy choices as staff applies them to the budget.
I agree about the whole concept of flexibility. The reason why I am supportive of having policies is it gets you to that clarity that you want to have, not only with yourself, but with your community. So it's not a but, it's more of an and, that we need to establish policies and get reactions to them and set them, but within that context, policies need to be able to be flexible, because there is always going to be unanticipated circumstances that are going to put your policies to the test. The recession we went through has put a lot of our policies to the test in a very big way. And an inflexible organization is doomed. And every inflexible organization I've ever seen is either lost big time or has had to learn to be flexible. We should build flexibility in from the beginning, but the flexibility has got to be based on something that exists. And so we still need to have policies, and those policies need to be clear because they need to provide that touchstone, but we have to acknowledge everything that Mike says. Even as you establish policies, you have to be willing to be flexible when the circumstance demands it, and be comfortable being flexible when the circumstance demands it.
I've heard, and I think that staff could give you examples of this, that other communities have reserve policies that include what their goal is. And then if something happens, so they have to do, what are the triggers that would allow you to make other choices? And then what are your goals to refill your reserves? And so you have the whole thing in place that thinks about, you will likely not have a perfect situation. You will have things that you don't know about. So here's how you go about dealing with that. But then you have to have a goal to get those back to the place where they're at a level and make sure cities not end up in bankruptcy or something. So I think we can find examples of those in other places, and we already have the basis of that. So I think we could do that.
Thank you. I think all the discussion on those topics is important. I'm not sure if that is really what we need to be spending our initial time doing. I think that's almost putting the cart before the horse. In my mind, what I feel we should be doing over this session and the next couple sessions is specifically looking into what kind of budgetary cuts can we make and what type of potential revenues can we create. And then as time allows, once we work through that process of filling this gap and looking forward to a more stable budget, then we start working on policies on how it might influence those dollars that we have now come to a conclusion that we can work on. Because I'm afraid that we can get into such a rhetoric on the policy statement and how we come up with recommendations that we never get to the nuts and bolts of the money.
And I really think that's what we need to be focusing on, is the nuts and the bolts of the money so that the city can function.
Well, the reason why I asked Christie earlier if she could supply us copies of these questions is because I anticipated a robust discussion by the entire budget committee over these exact questions on setting some policies for the council to consider. So yeah, I'm comfortable with that aspect. I agree 100% with you, Laura, on that one. Bob, I think what we're going to get into is a chicken and egg conversation on cuts in revenues and policies, because without the right policies in place, how do you know what cuts to make and what revenues to spend? But if you make cuts in revenue and suggestions on building revenue, then you can better form your policy. So we're going to have to make a decision on which route are we going to take. There's two roads that we can take. Either one of them is not going to be a very easy road, but as a committee, actually in the entire city organization, needs to make that decision on which way do we go. And then once we make that decision, we need to stay the course until we get to the end of that road.
Agreed.
Yeah, and I can appreciate the concern of getting mired down in a policy discussion, but I think it needs, I don't know that we need to create a policy around every single bullet point that's up on these lists, but I think there are a couple of things that do really ground in terms of how the budget, particularly, the question of reserves, unexpected revenues. But I think if we don't have those, then we can just get lost in the wilderness, that we don't have a compass kind of to guide us. And I have pretty strong faith in the staff in terms of understanding there's an endpoint to this process and we need to have some kind of product by a certain date. So I feel pretty confident that staff can help keep us on track to complete the work in a timely way to meet those goals, because they're required to do so, and I've seen them do that before. So I think we can do some of the policy framing, maybe not take the whole thing, but pull out the real, I think the ones that need to happen sooner rather than later, and work those out, and then get into the actual numbers of expenditures, cuts, revenues, whatever we end up talking about.
Betty was next.
I agree with Bob that what we should be concentrating on now is revenue sources and cuts if necessary, and whether to cut something. I think we do have some policies, whether or not we decide to modify or change them. We do have some currently, but I think the purpose of this body is to think about money and how do we spend it right now. And I agree with him that we could easily get sidetracked and talk about all sorts of things and what do we mean by this, accessible culture and so forth. And I don't think that's what we're here for. Thank you.
So I really am going to go back to the part that you said at the beginning about how valuable it is to have diverse perspectives around the table. Just remember that we talked about that. Because I'm totally at a different place on the spectrum, I think, Bob, than you are. I feel like without having at least some of these conversations around policy, it's really challenging to know where we should be thinking about the cuts and the revenues. And I agree that us parsing the word accessible in this context is probably not particularly valuable. And maybe some of that is, as the council goes back and discusses, are these still our goals, which it sounds like there was a start at a retreat and that will continue. Maybe the council wants to parse that or not, I don't know. I agree, that's not what we want to do here. I feel like in order for me as a citizen member to weigh in a smart and thoughtful way about what do we want to cut and what do we want to consider for revenues, both of which I think are critical, some of this framework is going to be really, really valuable for us to do that in a thoughtful way where we're not just doing it for this year, but we're also doing it for the long term.
John?
A couple of thoughts. One of the, I think, basic policies that would be great for the council and the budget committee to agree on is, are we budgeting year to year or are we budgeting a 5 to 6 year forecast? it makes a significant difference in how you go about putting together the budget. And so even when you get into revenues and expenditures, and so that, our approach has been the 5 to 6 year. Not everybody does that, and there's pros and cons for both of those approaches, but I think that's an example of one that would be helpful. The flexibility, I think, also is important. What's hard is implementing flexibility. Everybody will have a different opinion on that. I mean, the 8% reserves is a good example of that. That's what we've been trying to achieve. If you were to go back and look at the budget for the last 5 years and look at the forecast, you'll probably see very few current or forecasted years in which there's actually an 8% reserve. It's not because we don't want to achieve that, but the trade-off of actually hitting that every time is pretty significant, and so you automatically make those kinds of trade-offs. And so I know Laura, one time I think in a meeting we talked about it's how you implement the policy is part of the challenge. And so flexibility is great. How do you narrow that? It may be just having the robust conversation also helps, so there's a perspective on that.
I think about the community, and I think about all the questions that the community has been asking about our budget process. So my hope is that through the work done here, that we will answer a lot of those questions and clarify those things for the public. So as we go out, we can answer them for them and help them understand the reasons why we're doing things, the rationale for it, what we were agreed on as a budget committee, are the goals of the city and how we're going forward. I just think a lot of this is to get clarity so that you can take clarity up to the community so these questions just don't keep floating around, because they're not going to go away. When you head out to explain this budget, the transparency and the shared understanding you have of what we're trying to do is going to make all the difference in whether the community gets it or not. So I think it's a really important thing here not to shortchange them.
Will? So I think making a policy decision in a vacuum tends to be very difficult. And as I look at the two different approaches that are being couched here, I'm wondering if there might be a way to combine them. So, for example, if we're looking at a budget that needs to be cut by a certain amount, and there's one-time money we could use to supplement that or reduce that cut, we now have a chance to do both the policy decision and the actual look at the dollars and cents decision and say, okay, we have to cut this much, or we have to raise this much revenue, we have a chance to use some one-time money. Do we try to offset that with bonds, or what is the practical thing that we can do here? And there are policy decisions behind that, and that policy discussion will have to occur, but it will happen within a framework of the actual dollars and cents, rather than maybe what might be a little too meta, a little too removed from the actual decision, to where when you go to make the actual decision, you end up boxing yourself in, as was discussed earlier. So I'll put that out there as a suggestion of one possible way you could kind of sort these out would be to try and set your meetings up so that you were looking at when is the right time to use one-time money in the context of what we might use it for, or how much reserve do we want in the context of what is our reserve trending looking like, and how much might we have, or what we might do, why we might want to change it. So I think answering it in that context might be more valuable. Jill?
I don't think it'd be that hard, really, to go through the policies, the 5 that Christy gave us. I mean, it'd be a really good starting point. You take the 5, what are they? Allow X amount of discussion for each of those, of which the budget committee could participate in, and then the council, following one meeting or 2 meetings, whatever is appropriate. I mean, if we kind of dovetail our time, this council can meet and decide what they want to revise and what they want to change. I mean, I think we could go through it in a very efficient manner. And then at that point, because the only challenge I see with what Will is proposing is that 5 policies or more could be impacting the one decision of what revenue to increase or decrease. So then now we're having 5 policy discussions while discussing one line item. I mean, the thing could just spin out. Why not we just take them in order, go through them, figure out what everybody likes, what they don't like, move on. I mean, I think we could just try it that way.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I'll try. I think I might agree with Jill. I mean, as I listened to this, I found myself wanting to kind of take sides here. I am interested I have been interested since I came in here of us getting to the discussion about this gap. And as I listen to this and as I look at the things up there and I think about the discussion over the last several months, particularly as we had it with the community, I find myself thinking, while we may, in terms of this group, not be setting policy, I think I understand that, I think it's important that as we get into the discussion about closing that gap and how we do it, to have some discussion about these things so that we collectively have some sort of framework for ourselves about how we're going to go forward into that detail. I mean, there are several things up there I just think we ought to talk about a little bit about how we collectively feel about them before we really start engaging the detail of discussions, program reductions, or additional revenue. The other thing that kind of drives me there, I guess I don't want to get ahead into expected outcomes, but I have come into this process with a belief that a good result, at least as far as I'm concerned, is that at the end of the 6-month period that we've really engaged, we've talked about that gap that we've been talking about the last couple of years and certainly this year, and I think that we really just kind of, we used one-time funds this time through, and in my mind what we were saying was, well, now we're going to spend 6 months or a year and we're going to sit down and figure out how to deal with that. And I guess kind of how to deal with that for me translated into that as we start the next budget process, maybe we have figured that out. Maybe we've addressed some program reductions and or, revenue additions or whatever they look like. So I think we can control this. I think we can keep it reined in. I don't think we have to get mired in it a lot, but I think we need to do some of this discussion and then get into the discussion about the gap. So I think I kind of agree with Jill.
Yeah, I think I can riff off of Ken because he's really kind of saying what I was going to say. The itch for us was we have to walk out of this series of meetings with some agreement about what we're going to do about the fiscal year 15 budget. That's really what kind of precipitated this. We said we were going to spend the one-time money last year and come up with solutions because we're going to have a deficit next year and we won't have the reserves necessarily that we had this year to spend on. So we are under pressure. There is an expectation we'll come out of here with a revenue cut, hybrid, balance, whatever, recommendation for the fiscal year 15 budget. I think that's what everybody's expecting. But whatever that recommendation is, it is a reflection of what our policies are. So I'm thinking we have to do these things concurrently. We have to kind of spin both those plates at the same time on the ends of sticks. And in order to be able to do that, we've got to be very careful with our time so we don't get mired in either of those two conversations. I don't want to get mired down so much in policy that we don't scratch the itch that we know we have to do. But at the same time, I don't want to come up with a whole bunch of recommendations about the fiscal year 15 budget that don't reflect our goals and policies. I've had this concern in the past that in some previous budgets we've done exactly that. We've recommended budgets that didn't really have that much to do with our goals and policies. They were just, what did we do last year? Let's fund it again this year, and then we're done. We need to blend those two together, but we can't do one to the exclusion of the other. We're going to have to do both.
Giving people time to think a little bit. We have plenty of time. Or we could move on early to the next topic. Move on early. Everybody feel we discussed this to the point that we're saturated at this point?
I guess I'm not, but I'm not quite sure, maybe it's not critical to know, so what happens to the discussion now? And maybe that's a future conversation that somebody has, but if we were to meet again tomorrow, what would happen?
Well, I agree. I mean, I think that that's certainly part of what we want to do at the end of the day is take a lot of these things because we talked about a number of things that we have heard today. Are these still our council goals? That's a conversation that needs to happen probably at the council level, right? There was a question about how philosophically are we addressing new needs that continue to come to us, or the fact that there's less funding from other entities, and how do we want to take that into consideration? There's questions about policy and how we weigh in and how that impacts then us getting started on the digging into the nitty-gritty. So, we can take all that at the end if that's the easiest way to go, but we definitely do want to walk out of here today with a clear understanding, I think, of what we want to do in some of these next meetings and when we're actually going to spend the time to dig in to some of these questions.
It may require you to ask for this motion just to bring it to closure.
Okay. We can do that.
Well, or an alternative might be to regroup at the end of the day and review some of these things and ask the folks who helped prepare today's agenda, which I believe was you,
Councilor Polling and Mayor
Councilor Polling, Councilor PRYOR.
No, Councilor Polling and John and the Mayor.
That could be another way that you sort through the various imperatives that we've come up with and come up with a plan of attack at our next meetings.
And this conversation was about role and responsibilities, not about policy particularly, right? I mean, part of it is...
Correct.
And so have we agreed on roles, or that may or may not be important right now? Is that part of what we're...
I felt like, please other people join in, I felt like we got a pretty good conversation about roles in terms of Budget Committee's input. I heard a pretty clear consensus about, like to have Budget Committee involved in a conversation about these policy questions, but that the final decision on some of these would rest with Council. And then we would use that as we start to get into the nitty-gritty discussion about cuts and revenues and that kind of thing. The only piece that we didn't talk about specifically, and I don't know if we need to, is the question about, is the Budget Committee involved in that same way around conversations around revenue? So I don't know if councilors have any thoughts on that.
I don't see why not.
Okay.
Any further thoughts?
Or questions about roles that people are not still feeling like we need to have more conversation there.
Betty?
If we're going to change our policies, this is not the time or the place to do it.
Can you clarify that a little bit more?
Well, the policies were developed by council.
Right, okay.
And if we're going to change them, I don't think that the Budget Committee meeting is the time to do it. I think we should look them over again sometime, but not right now.
Can I ask, Betty, are you referring to the ones in green back there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when I was speaking earlier about policies, I was talking specifically about policies related to budgeting. And I agree with you that in terms of the overarching vision, goals and outcomes, that should be a council discussion. And I don't know if, while I agree with Mayor PIERCY that I think it's worth revisiting those, I don't know that we'll have the capacity to do that and this process at the same time. So when I was talking about Budget Committee input on policies, I was really speaking to policies that are directly related to budgeting.
And so to piggyback on that, Claire, then my understanding is that we would be going forward with those goals as they are today for the context of this process that we develop in looking forward through the next budget cycle, assuming that then that's something council could take up at a future date to revisit.
I think just practically speaking, that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah, okay.
And then at the end, we can talk about timing, because part of it is right after break, and even now, staff is fully engaged in the FY15 budget. And so some of the decisions that get made from the council and the budget committee will have a direct impact on that. And so there is some timing around that, particularly if there is a need for whatever reason to reduce services somewhere, and it's how do we decide which places we start picking and choosing from, because ultimately we'll have to present a budget if some of those are the cases. And so it's those kinds of things that will be helpful, or if not, we'll kind of keep moving the way we've been doing it. So eventually we'll have to talk a little bit about timing on which conversations occur around the policies and how those get nailed down, I think.
You can wrap some of that up towards the end of the day.
That's fine.
Other thoughts? We covered a number of topics here, roles and responsibilities and policies, and also touched on the council goals and small placards. Just to clarify again, these are part of our policies, and they're financial policies, and these are council goals. So that's a way to think of them as separate batches. And it's not a surprise that we're not making a decision today. We're not driving towards a decision. That's really wasn't the intent or the plan for today, but rather to build understanding, to build clarity, to exchange thoughts, ideas, to raise issues and concerns, and then build on that for the future. And we'll have a chance, as Laura and John said at the end of today, to refine that a little bit, and the process committee can move it towards agendas for next meetings. Mayor?
I think it would be helpful, and I don't know whether the smaller group is the appropriate place to do it or where, but I really think for this group to know how we expect to get from where we are to where we need to end up, and what kind of decisions will need to be made to get us there, and the timing involved will be an important thing for us to do, because understanding what it would take to get us where we need to be at the end will drive us through the conversation in a way that will move us along the right way. And I think there has to be more than just agenda to agenda. It has to be a timeline.
And I want to make sure no one misconstrued my concern about getting into the numbers as to diminish the policy. I know we have to go through that, and they do go hand in hand. I think one of my concerns is, we're about to go on council break. We're not going to be back together as a group until the end of September. So I want to say I'm very sensitive to staff at this point, and this is where this comment's coming from. If we start throwing out ideas on potential revenue sources, and I know I have a number in the back of my head, and I'm sure some of you have ideas too, who's going to do the work for us on fleshing out whether or not those ideas might come to fruition? Well, it's going to be staff. And my concern is if we wait until September, then we have a series of fairly fast-hitting meetings over the next couple months, or 2 weeks apart. I don't know if that's going to give staff enough time to come back with the answers to the questions we may be pushing out there as, could this be a potential revenue source for us, as composed to getting into some of that conversation today. And potential revenue sources don't always directly affect the policies, but it could. If we have enough newly generated revenue to create a stable budget, it could completely eliminate the first one. When do we use one-time money? So that's why I was saying I would like to see, I would love for us to come out of today's meeting going, we got something accomplished, other than just talking about potential policy revisions and changes.
So given that, I think that's a really helpful comment, especially to that sort of how do we spin the two plates thing. So what Christy and I were just talking about is if it works for people, we're a little bit ahead of time. And so maybe if we could take just a 5-minute, quick break, and then we can regroup about the rest of the afternoon's agenda and how we go forward with some of the things we thought were valuable to cover, and also perhaps figure out if there's a way to at least start some of those things we know we want to gather information about, so that staff can start to think about some of those things. Okay, does that work for everybody? Does that work for you guys? Okay.
Before we transition, I just wanted to make a quick comment because I'm taking notes on my phone, and I realized somebody looked at me earlier and I thought, they probably think I'm just texting over them. So if you are curious, I am actually taking notes on my phone and kind of in between my Facebook posts.
That's right.
And you're tweeting.
I posted all of you on Facebook, just so you know.
We've all been tagged.
I think I need to sign a release form.
So as part of the process during the course of the day, we wanted to break you out into some small group discussions. I think you get into a different quality of discussion when you break down, and then we'll give you a chance to bring that information back. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by having Laura frame a little bit about how we're going to use this time, and then I'll talk to you about the process of using it.
Great. So thank you all so much for the conversation today. It is really helpful. Clearly, one of the places we want to end at the end of today is to be able to leave here knowing what we need to still learn and know, so that staff can spend their time wisely collecting some information for us between now and our next meeting, and so that our process team can leave here today knowing what we need to do to build a roadmap going forward, so that when we come here in September, the roadmap from where we are today to where we need to end is clear, and we know September, this is step one of the roadmap, and here's what that looks like. So to that goal, I think this afternoon we're really going to have some small group conversations that really touch on whatever it is that, from what we've talked about today, has been valuable for you, where you feel like this is someplace that's really important to dig in further, so that we leave here with an understanding of this is a place that we need to be able to spend more time, we need more information, we need more context, something. That's sort of where and then, are we doing the community engagement process in small groups?
Infused into that.
Okay, so infused into that, not the primary goal of your small group conversation, but we do want to make sure we collect thoughts about community engagement today, because one of the things we don't want to do is lose all the time between now and September in terms of thinking about how we start to communicate with the community about what our process is and how we start to engage the community. Just as one piece of information, Jan Bowman and I right now are working on an op-ed for the Register Guard that just lets the community know that we had this meeting today and kind of tease up the fact that we are talking about some of these policy things, revisiting in the context of goals, and here's what we're going to be doing going forward. So that'll be the first piece of at least some outward-facing communication. And then the goal, though, is to just also have your input on what are some of the best ways, and we've heard some around the table today about neighborhood associations and that kind of thing, but other ways that we want to make sure that some of this great context that we've heard today gets clearer for the community, and that we get input and feedback and trust building along the way. So that would be a piece of the conversation. Ken, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Just to clarify, so when you all come back in, we all come back, and you come back in September with the roadmap, is the roadmap at that point going to describe the end result, or are we today going to come up with ideas about what the attributes of that final destination look like?
Well, we are going to have a piece later today where we talk about best and worst outcomes, which I think helps with that. So I think the goal today is for us to understand, first of all, where people want that outcome set to be and what that looks like. But we know that the end outcome has to be a budget. I mean, ultimately that's the outcome we have to have. And so given the amount of time that we have and what we hear today about what people still need to want to learn more about or feel like needs to be developed along the way, that will help us, I think, work with staff also about how do we balance that need for additional background information with the need to actually start getting into the nitty-gritty, because we're going to need to drive towards a specific deadline. Does that make sense? Other questions, or do you want to jump in, Denise, with some?
No, that was a great context, because I think it helps people know what they're going to be asked to talk about based on what's going to happen with that information. So let me talk to you a little bit about the process that we're going to use. We're going to ask you to do 2 different conversations. So the first one is going to be more of a free flow, and I'll describe that to you, and it'll build off of some of the topics that you've been talking on this morning. The second one is going to be a best outcomes, worst outcomes conversation. How many people here have experienced the best outcomes, worst outcomes question? Okay, quite a few of you. So I won't spend a lot of time, but when we're ready to transition to that one, I'll do the chime thing, and we'll just take a couple of minutes and regroup and switch your brains and put you onto that conversation. The first one, the way we'll be organizing you in your tables, each of your signs has a dot on it, a colored dot. And this table, what is your color? Orange is here. Pavel, what's your color? Blue. Blue. Jessica?
Pavel, we're going outside.
Green. Oh, I'm just going to pick up the table, move it out of the room. So that's where your colors are located. We've been intentional about grouping you so that there's a variety of roles sitting at your table, and that each of you has a member of the process committee there also, because they're the ones that are gathering this information and going to be looking at next steps with it. So in a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask you to get up and go to your tables. You have finance staff at each of your tables. Their job isn't specifically to facilitate, but to take really good notes. So know that everything that's flying on whatever topic, that's going to be captured, and that information is going to be once again fed to the process committee to help them prioritize how do they look at that roadmap for you folks over the next few months. So their job is to take that in. So do enjoy this conversation and your diverse perspectives. What I'll remind you is you're self-facilitating at your tables, so I really encourage you to make sure that you're inviting each other in and sharing that airtime so that everybody's able to get out the information that's important for them. We had made some suggestions on your agenda. You've talked a little bit about some of the policy information. That's still another topic if there's something else connected to that, or some questions that come up for you. So what we can be capturing is thoughts, questions that you have, needs that you identify. Part of this might be, in order for me to support this process, I need this additional information. And we talked about the fact that staff's going to be busy putting it together. So some insight into what are the thoughts that are on your mind, what are the questions, what are ideas that you've got, might be around policy review, might be around public engagement, might be around revenue idea generation, whatever, as you think about this process. That's where your conversation is going to go. We're not prescribing it, but it's all around that goal of getting you to where you're hoping to be at the end of the time. I'm going to let you go to your tables, engage in this conversation. I'll come around and do a little bit of a barometer, give you about a 5-minute when we're ready to transition so you can start wrapping those conversations, and then we'll take just a few minutes to move you on. Jan?
How much time overall are we spending?
We're looking at about 45 minutes, but we're running, the time is flowing this afternoon, and what I'd say is Larry and I will do a barometer and see how the quality of the conversations are going. If they're slowing down, we'll transition you into the next one. If they're real robust, we're going to let you go a little bit longer. So, any other questions before you begin? Okay, feel free to join your tables, start your conversations, share your airtime. We're going to take a few minutes to get some summaries from each table, just so the whole group hears some of the themes that were happening at the small individual tables. And there'll be an opportunity if there's any more conversation around that. I've set some colored cards around the table. If something dawns on you that's like, oh, I didn't get a chance to get that in or whatever, feel free to use those cards, write them up, we'll collect them, and it goes into the group memory bank as the process committee is going to move forward with it. From there, after we finish kind of debriefing the last couple of conversations, then I'm going to turn it back over to Laura, and she'll be inviting your feedback on next steps for that process committee. So it gives you an idea of where we're going, and as soon as you guys are done with valuable conversation, we'll cut you loose. So the groups, is there a group that's ready to share insights from that? No, not your whole list. I'd say probably 3 to 5 key things, just quickly. Does this work?
Yes.
Turn it on.
Does that work? All right, from Yellow, there was a lot of conversation about how to engage the community, talking about needing to engage the community, using some existing channels, such as neighborhood associations, and in some new ways, better use of social media, and maybe use of gaming. So we talked about that, talked about ways to build trust with the community, find out what people want or need to know, what kinds of accountability they want from us, and interact with them in language that makes sense to people, not using jargon and so forth. I can go on. I mean, there were other themes, but I'll stick with that one. So.
And they'll get captured. Just if each table's got 3 to 5 quick ones.
Oh, sorry.
Well, Team Blue had a very extensive discussion. Some of the common themes that have emerged, we talked a lot about community engagement and restoring trust and building trust, and how to define community engagement as part of the FY15 budget process. There was also a discussion about maybe redesigning the budget process, finding points in the process where the City Council and the Budget Committee can get a little bit more involved at an earlier point and have sort of an early input into the process. There was also a discussion about matrix and using data to support various committee deliberations and discussions, and what are the best sort of strategies for using that one. And there was also a number of other points, but they sort of revolved around these major points that we discussed. Did I miss anything in particular that Team Blue feels strongly about? I know it's a very high-level summary, but... Yes?
Does Mike want a few minutes?
No. There are colored cards that you feel
I'm the only one standing. I'll sit down.
I would only say the metrics issue was only germane, in my point, around the idea of measuring decisions for economic impact and tax base impact. We're talking about how to grow revenue all the time, but we're not talking about council decisions that affect tax base and effective means to measure it so that we know when we're deciding.
So our table, there was quite a broad discussion. Some of the information needs we talked about were some of the questions that came up during the election, so the difference between the CAFR and the budget. Information on funds, kind of the fund discussion we talked about earlier. Information on economic development, annexation, and then other sources of funding. So there was some discussion around bonding. So bonding for not only things like capital projects, fire, but maybe incorporating some of things like equipment and different things into bonding. And then we also talked, another theme was the articles of faith at the community. What does the community believe? So where are there pots of money somewhere? PERS costs, personnel costs. Are we efficient? What do we have to do? Does the organization have to bleed kind of before the Band-Aid's put on? Those sorts of things.
So we were yellow table back there. Some of the highlights were regarding public engagement. How do we get viable input from the broader community? The budget process, this is an observation rather than a question. The budget process has been without spending discipline. I think in reference to policies, the financial policies. We need exit strategy for one-time funding that's used for ongoing services. How do we get input to the city manager prior to formulation of the proposed budget? That is the budget committee getting input to city manager. Does council have appetite for system-wide revenue source for fees? As a question to answer early. And regarding the existing cut list, referencing that, and how do we make decisions about possible reductions in services? What's a system-wide view on services that might be reduced, and how does this fit into bigger discussion on prioritization within the budget? Need to take or discuss the setting of priorities for services. Priorities need to be balanced. I think that covers it.
Okay. I didn't do my group justice because I only did one kind of theme. I'll give you the rest of them. So we also, in the Orange team, talked about using ideas from other communities and previous work that we've done so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. Some of the examples were what George brought up about Portland and how they've engaged the community, the Meeting the Challenge, revenue discussions and how that happened, and revenue ideas from other communities. We also talked about how solving the gap is probably going to require a combination of approaches, and some of the things that we may have rejected in the past as being not really of sufficient size to solve the gap may now be appropriate to look at again and bundle some of those together instead of looking for one big solution. And then we talked about what gap we're responsible for solving, a little bit about when the county and others have shortfalls and how we get into that. And then the last thing was really a conversation about funding City Hall. You know, that's a council discussion. How can the budget committee help? Talking not just about the immediate project, but the long-term strategy. You know, how do we pay for that in the long run? So I think that covered the main themes of the Orange group. So,
any other debrief information from the groups?
I might add a little bit from our group, building on that gaming theme. We didn't talk about gaming, but there was, initially when we met with our group, a lot of curiosity, I thought, about some of the things we've done in the past. So some curiosity around how we've implemented innovation, how we've used the Victory Garden, what were the results of that, some curiosity about, we know how you saw the $5.3 million package, but what direction did John give, you know, senior staff that started us down that course? And just, it was more, I think, around how do we learn from what you've done and understanding kind of the game. You know, it's not a game, but it's like, tell us about what happened back here so we can understand it and learn from it and maybe either implement it again or do something different. And I thought that was a pretty, we talked about that for quite a bit, I thought.
Anyone else from these conversations, something that stood out to you that you want to make sure that the full group hears together?
So I just want to bring up one thing that Sue, in her excellent description of the Orange Group's work, that she didn't talk about, and it was really the final comment that Chief Kearns, who was largely quiet, but, you know, packs an impact when he does speak, said at the end, which was about, I think it was Commissioner Fish, was that who spoke about it in Portland, but talking about making sure that we are thoughtful about the decisions and the places that we spend being places that help the community, invest in places where people are growing or improving their life, and even sometimes considering disinvesting in programs that enable people not to be growing in their life, right? And we talked about it in one way in the context of things around homelessness, but it could be in a lot of other contexts, right? So what are making sure that you're investing in ways that actually drive you towards outcomes for the community that you want, which is an opportunity to look at just things we're spending money on and are they actually driving us to those outcomes or not? And are there things even to disinvest in that perhaps we've just always done, but aren't necessarily driving to the outcomes we want, which I thought was a really interesting perspective. So.
Great. And was there anything in the best and worst outcomes discussion that anybody would want to share? Or those will be collated and pulled together. I just wanted to double check to see if there were any high points there.
I'll add something. So the only thing that, so I was in the Orange group, and one of the things that was sort of a common thing was building community trust and increasing transparency and building understanding about how we've gone about solving the budget problems in the past and how to engage them moving forward, and how important it is to figure out, you know, a successful process will really be having an engaged community that's involved in the process, and that, you know, they have a lot of trust in the decisions that are being made because they have a better understanding about it.
I just want to add to that, that one of the things we've talked about is you want to get input from the public on the budget and engage them, but don't want to come to them after you already have it pretty much put together, because that is one way to just actually get them to think that you had your mind made up about what the answer was before you asked them. And so finding a way to have the conversation, such as John had with all of us today at the beginning, like creating a threshold of understanding, at least in some parts of our community, that you can build on.
I guess I'll second the mayor's talk. One of the, I'd very much like to see some new revenue. I think a lot of us would. One of the successful campaigns last year was the school bond, and what they did was engage early. And I think last summer they released their consultants report, and that consultants report had a couple of toxic areas, including the closure of Edison and did something with Civic Stadium, both of which are problems that have to be dealt with, but not necessarily in the context of that bond. And through their public feedback process, they came up with a bond that had no organized opposition. I was initially skeptical of their process, but it seems like a reasonable process to me, especially if we are considering new revenue, or cuts for that matter, that we get it on the street early and listen to the opposition about what things really will make a difference. And there are people who are just cranks, but there are also people who have some different ideas out there, and we should listen to them and consider some different points of view and maybe drop some things that don't need to be done immediately. So I guess I would commend that process, even though it does take more time and effort. It seems to have been well worth it for at least for the school program.
Well, for the yellow group, the best and worst outcomes had some reflections. Worst outcome included using one-time money. Best outcome was not using one-time money. Losing public confidence was worst. Gaining public confidence was best. Dramatic cuts worse. Moderate or maintaining current services best. So you can see that there's reflection between the two. One thing that was raised in the worst outcome was that if public infrastructure is damaged as a result of the budget problems continuing, that we don't have a successful solution, it'll make the city less attractive to investment, and that'll have long-term consequences. So we have our final piece today, our final topic, and that's the next steps. What do we do next? And I'll turn it over to Laura to lead the discussion on this. And we don't have preconceived questions or direction for this.
Okay. I'm not sure I have a clear direction for this either. Was this with the cards?
No, this is just kind of your closure.
Okay, got it. And then this is a final thing for anything people didn't get?
If somebody's got something else that hasn't been captured somewhere else
Okay.
during the day, they can just write it down, make sure it gets turned into staff.
Okay.
And I think we saw this as you just being able
Great.
to invite
Yeah.
conversation around next step.
Well, I'll start the conversation, and certainly that's just a starting point, so I'd welcome people to jump in with other thoughts. This is a lot to absorb, probably for everybody in the room, but a really valuable, I think, conversation about process about things we need to learn, about where we need to engage further with information and with policies and with the community. So what I leave here thinking is that there's been a lot of conversation and a lot of sharing about additional information people would like, whether that's background about funds and how those are structured, whether that's information about the difference between the CFAR and the budget, whatever these things are, and that hopefully we've been able to capture most of that today, what those things are that people want to learn more about. I think our process committee, one of the things we'll do is look through those and figure out what's the best way for those things to be addressed. Can some of them be addressed? Do they all need to be addressed in person? Probably not, right? Some of them can be addressed maybe via some informational emails. Maybe some of them are addressed in some other optional forums for people who want to dive in. What are the best ways? I don't have the answer, but what are the best ways to address some of those things? And then what are the things that really the group felt we really need to spend group time on? And how do we build a roadmap that includes some of these bigger, policy-ish conversations, but allows us the time that we're going to need to build the actual budget? And so I think that's what our process group will need to look at, gathering all this information and saying, given that we have this much time frame, which is this many hours to talk, how much of that can we spend on some of the philosophical stuff, and how much of it do we really need to dive into numbers, and how do we balance those? I believe that one of the things we'll want to come out with today, and that the process group will want to start talking about, and that I invite additional feedback if you haven't already provided it in your small groups, is this community engagement process should start soon. And we need to start building that soon, because we don't want to lose the time between now and September when people come back to school and they've got holidays on their minds, and this is a great time to at least start thinking about how we're going to build that. And so I believe that the next steps would be to take all the information we've heard today and actually start to kind of triage some of that out. And so this is a place where if you really feel like, I want to make sure that this is like the number one thing that we've got to do next, this would be a great time to hear that. But I think we will be able to gather, these are some of the critical things that that every table and around the room said, we really need to spend some time here. And then I think it's a process of us also working with staff to say, as I think you said, Claire, they're really good at saying, here's the time we have to allow probably to really go into the budget, and therefore here's the time that we can allow for some of the additional policy-related or other philosophical conversations. Thoughts? Doubt? Doubt is okay.
I was mumbling, sorry. I'm think doubt. Sorry.
Think doubt, okay, good.
I think that's a good outline. I approve. I think what might be helpful is if you guys come together and scope out what those big agenda items are that we may think we've all identified. As soon as you have that list, if you could share that with us as a group, so if we see a glaring omission, we can weigh in and say, oh, we really need time to do it. It's not as great as being able to do it in front of everybody, obviously, to send an email, but I think that would be helpful in case there was some piece of whether, and I'm not talking about the specific questions of info that we need, but the big hits.
Right, okay. Thanks. Other thoughts, feedback?
I just want to make a pitch for if there are pieces of information that each of us should have because we will need it, that then we be sure that everybody gets it the same way. Because if you do, sort of some people go and get more information and others choose not to, we won't be facing making decisions with the same threshold of information, and that could in the long run get in our way.
So, and kind of just building on the mayor's comment, you mentioned, Laura, that a potential optional information session about the difference between the CAFR
possibility. I throw it out there. If that's terrible, let me know.
So I actually like that idea.
Okay.
I've talked to Christy about it before, but I don't know if that's what you mean. If there's an optional information piece that people can either come to or not, I mean, I would find value in that for me, but everybody may not, but then there's some people getting information that others may not, so I don't know.
I just want to express worry about, I mean, I can understand where some people might not be as keen on understanding it as others, but I do think those basic things that people talked about for months, we need to all have a shared understanding and hear the conversation, in my opinion.
And so maybe we can talk about, is there a way to do both? Is there a way to make that available and yet capture it in a way that everybody could either see or watch or something, so that everybody has that
Just
access?
something to
I
be
don't
careful
know.
about.
Yeah, okay, great. Other thoughts?
I just have another thought, and that is about the whole revenue discussion. And I don't know where the council is with this, but so there was just a ballot measure and it didn't pass. And so I don't know if going into this next year's budget, there's thought about there would be another revenue measure being contemplated or not. And I know timing is critical with all that, but I think from my perspective as the budget committee member, it would be helpful the earlier to know about that's feasible or not, or if that's going to impact this next year's budget process, or if we're really talking about or having to think about dealing with the revenue we know we have, other than, finer tweaks within the revenue we have, but not actual any new revenue sources. I don't know where that discussion happens, but it would be helpful.
So Ken actually brought up a very similar point in our small group discussion. His point was that if we are thinking there might be a possibility of trying to go out for some broader revenue, that would really affect how we all look at the budget decisions. There hasn't been any council discussion about that since the May election, but I did ask in our group if we could have as one of our information pieces a revisit of the various strategies that the city manager had brought to us, and others, if there are others, in terms of revenue.
Is that the Meet the Challenge, or was it something in additional?
I was not talking about Meet the Challenge.
So maybe, so that and some other conversation.
So one of the things that I brought up in our is that I think when you think of revenue, I think we need to be thinking further than this year. And so if we had a goal, let's say, I don't know whether it's 5 years or whatever that period of time is, and you set a goal that you thought if you did thus and such, you could get to this point in that amount of time, and you measure as you go along whether you're achieving that seems more doable to me than thinking that you're going to come up with something in the next few months that's going to, and it doesn't seem right to not be addressing it either. So there seems to me there needs to be sort of a longer range look at where we're going, and then take steps in that direction that we think have a chance of solving, both in terms of revenue and in terms of making those priority decisions. But I just think taking that, and that's of course yours, but that longer range thing just makes more sense to me.
Anybody else? Oh, yeah. So Christy just asked me if we could confirm meeting dates, and they are listed on your agenda.
Those are council meetings, each and every one of them?
They're all Monday nights, except for the Tuesday.
The Tuesday is two.
It's a council meeting, but it's yeah.
So let me understand. You're saying that instead of council meetings, we're having budget committee meetings each of those nights?
An option.
Right. I understood the purpose of the motion that I made, that we would have additional budget committee meetings in addition to what the council was already meeting. So those are council meetings. I might not understand it. I'm getting head nods here.
No, you are understanding those are council meeting dates, and there were some that expressed a desire to try to utilize some of that time for those meetings. If that's not what the group wants to do, we can go back and revisit the dates.
I'm not clear how we'll do both on each of those dates.
And like Mike, I was of the impression that these meetings were in addition, they were budget committee meetings, not folded in with just council meetings.
I hear you. And we can go back and find alternate dates to add to the regular council schedule, if that's the preference of the group.
I don't want to add more meetings. I think this is fine. And I thought it was good that you put them in place of some of the work sessions.
Chris is going to say halfway in the middle.
I guess I don't have an objection to having the budget committee meetings instead of the council meetings, except that I'd like to know what work we're not doing because we're doing that instead.
Right. She said. We got a ton of stuff.
So that would be my concern, is just looking at what's calendared out and making sure we're not bumping something that we really want to be getting at.
Agreed. And part of when these were scheduled is tentative dates for the group to consider. There wasn't anything on the calendar. It doesn't mean that there might not be something that comes up, but we were working on the fall calendar and those dates weren't scheduled yet.
Was George, I think you were next.
Yeah, I would. Yep. I personally, Councilor Taylor doesn't want any extra meetings, but I would rather see us meet, maybe on Tuesday night or something, Tuesday afternoon, because probably since this was drawn up, there actually have been several new work session requests turned in, and 3 or 4 or 5. So, and I think there'll probably be a couple more this week that I've had wind of. So, if we could switch those to a different day, I think we do actually need those kinds of work. And maybe not every single one of them, but if we could switch some of those at least to back to work sessions. I think we haven't, the topics seem to be building up, so I would be in favor of extra budget meetings like on Tuesday or something. For the rest of for the citizen members, it probably doesn't matter, but
it's more of a council.
It'd be it's more work for council, I suppose. But
George did a decent job addressing what I was going to say. I was just going to say that we voted the other night that we're going to do his work session here in another couple of weeks. We've got at least 2 that I asked for. We're coming back with the comprehensive plan for Santa Clara and River Road. I know that there's 4 other requests, and I was told we're going to finish Envision Eugene before the end of the calendar year.
Envision Eugene will not be finished in your or my career. just in the sense of it'll be a forever thing. So.
You got that, Neil? Right?
On camera.
Yeah, it's an ongoing process.
It's an ongoing
Point
process.
being, I think we have a fairly full agenda for the rest of the year of council meetings, and I don't think that's likely that we'll have time for this.
Mayor PIERCY, did you want to add
Only
something?
thing I was going to say is we can take a really good look at our regular council meetings and see when those are full of real action or not, and maybe there's a piece of those that could be used for.
If we have the time, let's do it.
I think we don't want to mess with our work sessions, so I do think there might be some council meetings that aren't as loaded that we could use.
Agreed. Agreed.
Well, and you also brought up the topic that Councilor Clark, one of the topics I heard discussed today was looking at the unincorporated areas.
Yes.
So maybe there's a way that some of those topics of interest will dovetail.
I was rather hoping they would.
Good. So it sounds like then council is going to go back and work with staff on looking at those work sessions and what dates will work, and then we'll come out again with a revised version of whether it's going to be these dates or some adjustments to that based on council work sessions. Okay, great.
Sorry.
TBD, but I'm glad we asked.
I'm flexible. I know, that's my...
Okay. John also wanted to make sure everybody knows at the end he will stay and give the bridge problem to anyone who is curious.
I'm in. Let's do it.
Those who are not, I guess.
I'm in, let's do it.
Is there something that we wanted to do as a final activity? Is there anyone else who want to comment on that before we move on to the final activity?
The 17-minute solution.
No? Yeah, so what is our direction for the final?
Those cards are for people to indicate any information they need. So anything you need, you feel hasn't been provided or hasn't been mentioned and added to the parking lot already, please write it down on the cards and give them to a finance staff person so we can try to provide that in the future. And with that, our agenda is done.
Da-da-da-da.
Okay. I will adjourn the meeting minus the bridge problem, which is optional. So before I adjourn, I just want to thank you all again for your time today. I think it can sometimes feel frustrating, where are we going? But I think there was actually a lot of good work that happened today and a lot of good conversation that will help us move forward.
Agreed.
And so thank you for taking a day out of what I know are very busy schedules to contribute. So thank you.
Thank you.
And we're adjourned. Okay. Bridge problem.